Chapter 13, Missing at Sea. Daisy May touched down on Palmyra late that afternoon. The crew had searched for Copperning's plane all day and had seen no trace of it. Daisy had dinner, then went to the base theater. He was watching the film when someone told him to report to the base commander immediately. When he got there, he was told that Green Hornet had never come in. "Holy smoke," he said. He knew that there were two possibilities. One was that Phillips' crew had turned back to Hawaii. The other was that there were, as Daisy phrased it, in the drink. Someone went to check with Hawaii, knowing that if Green Hornet was indeed down, they'd still have to wait until morning to search. Daisy went to bed. At around midnight, a sailor woke Daisy's radioman, Herman Sears, and told him that Phil's plane was missing. The Navy wanted to check Sears's radio log to see when the last contact with the plane was. Sears asked the sailor to wake Daisy, and he, Daisy, and Navy officials reviewed the log of the base office. It yielded little information. At 4:30 a.m., Green Hornet was declared missing. Two planes were now down, Copperning's and Phillips, taking 21 men with them. The Navy assumed command of the rescue effort. Once the sun was up, Daisy May would be sent out, along with at least 2 Navy flying boats and at least one other AAF plane. Because Daisy May and Green Hornet had flown side by side early in the journey, the searchers knew that Green Hornet had not crashed during the first 200 miles of the trip. It had apparently gone down somewhere between the point at which Daisy May had left it and Palmyra, a stretch of 800 miles. The trick was figuring out the direction in which any survivors would be drifting. The ocean around Palmyra was a hole of currents lying at the meeting point of the westward carrying north equatorial current and the eastward carrying equatorial countercurrent. A few miles of difference in latitude could mean a 180-degree difference in current direction, and no one knew where the plane had hit. The search area would be enormous. Each crew was given search coordinates. From Palmyra, Daisy May would fly north. From Oahu, several planes would fly south. Not long after sunup, the planes took off. Everyone knew that the odds of finding the crew were very long, but, said Sears, we kept hoping. Louis woke with the sun. Mac was beside him, lying back. Phil lay in his raft, his mind still fumbling. Louis sat up and ran his eyes over the sky and ocean in search of rescuers. Only the sharks stirred. Louis decided to divvy up the breakfast, a single square of chocolate. He untied the raft pocket and looked in. All the chocolate was gone. He looked around the rafts. No chocolate. No wrappers. His gaze paused on Mac. The sergeant looked back at him with wide, guilty eyes. The realization that Mac had eaten all of the chocolate rolled hard over Louis. In the brief time that Louis had known Mac, the tail gunner had struck him as a decent, friendly guy. Although a bit of a reveler, confident to the point of flippancy, the crash had undone him. Louis knew that they couldn't survive long without food, but he quelled the thought. A rescue search would surely be underway. They'd be on Palmyra later today, maybe tomorrow, and the loss of the chocolate wouldn't matter. Curbing his irritation, Louis told Mac that he was disappointed in him. Understanding that Mac had acted in panic, he reassured him that they'd soon be rescued. Mac said nothing. So Mac's kind of out of his mind and ate all the chocolate, and looked at him with wide, guilty eyes. The chill of that night gave way to a sweltering day. Louis watched the sky. Phil, weak from blood loss, slept. Mac, a shade short of being a redhead, burned in the sun. He remained in a dreamy, distant place. All 3 men were hungry, but they could do nothing about it. The fish hooks and lines were useless. There was no bait. As the men lay in silence, a purring sound began drifting gently between their thoughts. Then all 3 realized that they were hearing a plane. Searching the sky, they saw a B-25, high up and well to the east. Flying much too high to be a search plane, it was probably on its way to Palmyra. Louis lunged for the raft pocket, retrieved the flare gun, and loaded a flare cartridge. He couldn't stand in the soft-bottomed raft, so he tipped up onto his knees and raised the gun. He squeezed the trigger, the gun bucket in his hand, and the flare, roaring red, streaked up. As it shot overhead, Louis dug out a dye pack and shook it hurriedly into the water. A pool of vivid greenish yellow bloomed over the ocean. With the flare arching over them, Louis, Phil, and Mac watched the bomber, willing the men aboard to see them. Slowly the flare sputtered out. The bomber kept going, and then it was gone. The circle of color around the rafts faded away. The sighting left the castaways with one important piece of information. They had known that they were drifting, but without points of reference. They hadn't known in which direction or how fast. Since planes on the north-south passage from Hawaii followed a flight line that ran close to Green Hornet's crash site, the appearance of a B-25 far to the east almost certainly meant that the rafts were drifting west, away from the view of friendly planes. Their chances of rescue were diminishing. That evening, the search planes turned back for their bases. No one had seen anything. They would be back in the air at first light. Over the rafts, the daylight died. The men took sips of water, bailed seawater around themselves, and lay down. The sharks came to the rafts again to rub their backs on their undersides. Phil slept for most of the next day. Louis sipped water and thought about food. Mac continued to hunker down, speaking little. For another day, rescue did not come. It was sometime early the next morning, May 30th, when Louis, Mac, and Phil heard a broad, deep rumble of B-24 engines, the sound of home. Then there it was, low and right overhead, a blunt-faced whale of a plane heading southeast, plowing through the clouds, disappearing and reappearing. It was a search plane. It was so near the rafts that Louis thought he recognized the insignia of the squadron, the 42nd on the plane's tail. Louis grabbed the flare gun, loaded it, and fired. The flare shot straight at the bomber. For a moment, the men thought that they would hit the plane, but the flare missed, passing alongside the plane, making a fountain of red that looked huge from the raft. Louis reloaded and fired again. The plane turned sharply right. Louis fired 2 more flares past the tail. The plane was Daisy May. Its crewmen were straining their eyes at the ocean, passing a pair of binoculars between them. Searching was difficult that day, with lows of clouds closing and parting, offering the men only brief glimpses of the sea. Everyone felt a particular urgency. The missing men were their squadron mates and friends. If we ever looked for somebody on a mission, remember Shirshi? That day we were looking. The flares spent themselves and Daisy May flew on. No one aboard saw anything. The plane's pivot had only been a routine turn. Louis, Phil, and Mac watched Daisy May's twin tails grow smaller in the distance, then disappeared. Wow. For a moment, Louis felt furious with the airmen who had passed so close to them, yet had not seen them, for his anger soon cooled. From his days searching for missing planes, he knew how hard it was to see a raft, especially among clouds. For all he knew, he too had overlooked raft-bound men below him. But what had probably been their best chance of rescue had been lost. With every hour, they were drifting further west, away from the flight lanes. If they were found, the only way they could survive would be to get to an island. If they weren't found, their only way to survive would be to get to an island. To their west, they knew that there wasn't a single island for 2,000 miles. But if by some miracle they floated that far and were still alive, they might reach the Marshall Islands. If they veered a little south, they might reach the Gilberts. If they were lucky enough to drift to those islands, rather than passing by and out again into the open Pacific, they'd have another problem. Both sets of island belonged to the Japanese. Watching Daisy May fly away, Louis had a sinking feeling. This writer uses the sinking feeling a lot. As the castaways watched their would-be rescuers disappear over the horizon, not far away, George Smitty Smith, who had sat up the night before the crash talking to Phil about Stacey, was piloting his B-24 over the ocean, searching for any sign of the lost men. About 50 miles short of Barber's Point, a base on the leeward side of Oahu, his crew spotted something. Spiraling in for a closer look, Smitty saw a muddle of yellow rectangular boxes jostling on the surface. Large fish were circling them. The boxes had not come from the Green Hornet. They were too close to Oahu to have traveled that far, especially if the currents wouldn't have carried them in that direction. But Copperning's plane had probably gone down somewhere along the north-south flight lane, the lane over which Smitty was searching. The boxes may have been the last remains of Copperning's plane and the men aboard it. The boxes weren't the only sighting that Smitty had that day. In the same region where Green Hornet had crashed, he spotted a shock yellow object bobbling in the water. He swung his bomber down toward it. It appeared to be a provisions box, like the ones carried on B-24s, but he wasn't sure. Smitty flew loops around the box for 15 minutes. There was nothing anywhere near it. No debris, no rafts, no men. Smitty probably believed that he was looking at a piece of Phil's plane, and if he did, he was probably right. He flew back to Oahu, thinking of his friend Cece and all the pain she would feel when she learned that her fiancé was missing. On Oahu, the men of the 42nd Squadron were losing hope. Coopernill, Phillips, Zamperini, and Mitchell lost on their way to Palmyra. A ground crewman wrote in his diary, "I find it hard to get used to such a thing. Just the other day I drove them all to Kahuku and around, kidded around with them, but now they're probably dead." The other pilots acted as though nothing has happened and speak of sending the other fellows' clothes home as if it were an everyday occurrence. That's the way it has been played over this way. It's an everyday occurrence. The castaways' bodies were declining. Other than Mac's feast on the chocolate bars, none of them had eaten since that early morning breakfast before their last flight. They were intensely thirsty and hungry. After the B-24 sighting, they spent another frigid night, then a long fourth day. There were no planes, no ships, no submarines. Each man drank the last drops of his water. Sometime on the fifth day, Mac snapped. After having said almost nothing for days, he suddenly began screaming that they were going to die. Wild-eyed and raving, he couldn't stop shouting. Louis slapped him across the face. Mac abruptly went silent and lay down, appearing strangely contented. Maybe he was comforted by Louis' assertion of control, protected thereby from the awful possibilities that his imagination hung before him. Mac had good reason to lose faith. The water was gone. After the B-24 had passed over, no more planes had come, and the current was carrying them far from their paths tracked by friendly aircraft. If the search for them hadn't been called off, the men knew it soon would be. That night before he tried to sleep, Louis prayed. He had prayed only once before in his life, in childhood, when his mother was sick and had been filled with a rushing fever that he would lose her. That night on the raft, in words composed in his head, never passing his lips, he pleaded for help. As the lost men drifted further and further out of reach, their last letters reached their families and friends who did not yet know that they were missing. It was apparently military policy to wait for initial searches to be conducted before informing loved ones. On the day after the crash, Phil's final letter to his father arrived in Virginia. Reverend Phillips, who called his son by his middle name, Alan, had joined the Army and was now Chaplain Phillips at Camp Pickett. The last news of Alan had reached him weeks earlier in newspaper stories about Superman's saga over Nauru. Chaplain Phillips had carried clippings over the raid to the office of a local newspaper, which had run a story on Alan's heroism. As proud as he was, Chaplain Phillips was also frightened. "I sure hope that is the closest call he ever has," he wrote to his daughter. It was probably this fear that had led Chaplain Phillips to write to Alan to ask about the fate of the raft-bound men and his crew had found encircled by sharks that spring. In his last letter to his father, Alan was reassuring. The men were all safe. As for himself, Alan wrote, "I'm still in the same place I have been. All right again. Soon. So long for now." On the weekend after the crash, Pete, Virginia, and Louise Zamperini made an impromptu visit to the Coopernill's parents who lived in Long Beach. It was a merry meeting, and they all talked about their boys. After the visit, Pete wrote to Louis, asking him to tell Coopernill that his parents were doing great. Before sealing the envelope, he tucked in a photo of himself, smiling. On the back, he had scribbled an inscription, "Don't let 'em clip your wings." In Serenap, California, Peyton Jordan opened the letter that Louis had tossed out the window of the Green Hornet as the plane taxied for its last takeoff. "Dear Peyton and Marge," it read, "I am still alive and kicking around. Why? I don't know." That little turkey better take care of himself, Jordan thought. Phil's last letter to Cece reached her in Princeton, Indiana, when she was finishing her first year as a high school teacher. In his letter, Phil had written of the moon over Hawaii and how it reminded him of the last time he was with her. "I will never forget that time I spent with you. There are a lot of things which I never forget with you. Sweet. I'm waiting for the day when we can be doing things together again as we used to." He had closed this letter as he had so many. "I love you, I love you, I love you." No more messages would come from those lost men. Pete's letter to Louis made its way to the postmaster in San Francisco, where the 11th Bomb Group's mail was sorted. Someone wrote "missing at sea" on the outside and dropped it in the back to mail to Pete. A week had passed since Green Hornet had vanished. Intensive searching had yielded nothing. Every man on Phil's crew was officially declared missing, and in Washington the process of informing family members was set in motion. The men from Daisy Mays were told to return to the plane from Palmyra to Oahu. The search had been abandoned. The crew was dejected. They wanted to go on looking. As they flew back to Oahu, they talked of the lost men. At Kualoa, a second lieutenant named Jack Cray walked into the cottage to perform the grim duty of cataloging the men's things and sending them to their families. Louis's room was mostly as it had been when Louis had walked out that Thursday morning. Clothes, a footlocker, a diary instead with a few words about a rescue mission, a pinup of actress Esther Williams on the wall. The note that Louis had left in the locker was gone, as was the liquor. Among Louis's things, Cray found photographs that Louis had taken inside the plane. In some of them, Louis had forgotten to aim the camera away from the Norden bomb site, so Cray had to confiscate those. The rest of Louis's belongings were packed into his footlocker and ready to be sent to Torrance. On the evening of Friday, June 4th, 1943, Phil's mother, Kelsey, was in Princeton, Indiana. In the absence of her husband and son, she had sold the family house in Terre Haute and moved to Princeton to be close to her daughter, Martha, and future daughter-in-law, Cece, with whom she had become dear friends. That evening, when Kelsey was visiting Martha, someone brought her a telegram. I regret to inform you that the Commanding General, Pacific Area, reports your son, First Lieutenant Russell A. Phillips, missing since May 27th. If further details or other information of his status are received, you will be promptly notified. The telegram reached the Zamparinis that same evening. Louis called Sylvia, who had recently married a firefighter, Harry Flamet, who now lived in a nearby suburb with her husband. Upon hearing that her brother was missing, Sylvia became hysterical, sobbing so loudly that her neighbor ran to her. When the neighbor asked her what was wrong, Sylvia was crying too hard to speak. Eventually, she pulled herself together enough to call Harvey at the fire station. She was frantic and confused and didn't know what to do. Harvey told her to go to her mother. Sylvia put down the phone and ran straight out the door. Sylvia sobbed for the entire 45-minute drive. Weeks before, just after the Nauru raid, she had picked up her morning paper and seen, on the front page, a photograph of Louis, looking haunted, staring through a gaping hole in the side of Superman. The image had horrified her. Now, as she absorbed the news that Louis was missing, she couldn't stop seeing that image. When she pulled up her parents' house, she had to compose herself before she walked in. Her father was calm but quiet. Her mother was consumed in anguish. Sylvia, who, like the rest of the family, assumed that Louis had gone down in the ocean, told her mother not to worry. With all those islands, Sylvia said, he's reaching someone. With all those islands, Sylvia said, he's teaching someone hula. It's just kind of touching. All right, Pete arrived in San Diego. He has a toothbrush and a pocket knife in his pocket. He told his mother he'll make it. Perhaps that day or perhaps later, Louise found the tiny snapshot that had been taken on the afternoon Louis had left, when he had stood behind her on the front steps, his arm around her waist. On the back of the photograph, Louise wrote, Louis reported missing, May 27, 1943. The news of Louis' disappearance headlined the California newspapers and led radio broadcasts. On June 5th, the Los Angeles Evening Herald and Express ran a feature on the life of Zamp, which looked like an awful like an obituary. Peyton Jordan, now a Navy officer, was driving to his base when he heard the news on the radio. Jordan gasped. He drove into the base feeling numb and for a while did nothing at all. Then he started speaking to his fellow officers. Jordan's job was to train cadets in survival techniques, and he and the others considered the possibilities that might face Louis. All the officers agreed that if Louis had the right training, he might survive. Pete called Jordan and they talked about Louis. As Pete spoke his hope that Louis would be found, Jordan could hear his voice wavering. Jordan thought about calling Louis' parents, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had no idea what to say. That evening, he drove home and told his wife, Marge, who had known Louis well at USC. They moved through their routines in a quiet fog. They went to bed and lay awake in silence. In Torrance, Anthony Zamparini remained stoic. Louise cried and prayed. From the stress, open sores broke out all over her hands. Sylvia thought her hands looked like hamburgers. Raw hamburger. Somewhere in those jagged days, a fierce conviction came over Louise. She was absolutely certain. Somewhere in those jagged days, a fierce conviction came over Louise. She was absolutely certain that her son was alive. On Samoa, Stanley Pillsbury and Clarence Douglas were still in the hospital, trying to recover from the wounds incurred in Nauru. Douglas's shoulder was far from healed, and to Pillsbury, he seemed emotionally gutted. Pillsbury was in considerable pain The doctors had been unable to remove all the shrapnel from his leg, and he could feel every shard burning. He wasn't close to being able to walk. In his dreams, planes drove at him endlessly. Pillsbury was in his bed when Douglas came in, his face radiating shock. "The crew went down," he said. Pillsbury could hardly speak. His first emotion was overwhelming, guilt. "If I had been there," he said, "I could have saved it." Douglas and Pillsbury said little more to each other. They parted, each man swimming in grief. Douglas would soon be granted transfer back to the States. Pillsbury would linger on his cot in Samoa, hoping that he would one day walk again. On Oahu, Louis's friends gathered in the barracks. In the corner of one of the rooms, they hung a small flag in memory of Zam. It would hang there as Louis, Phil, and Mac drifted west, and the Allies, the 11th Bomb Group's 42nd Squadron among them, carried the war across the Pacific and into the throat of Japan. So that was chapter 13 in Laura Hildebrandt's book, Unbroken. Got a little touching, a little emotional at the end there. These characters, Louis, Pete, and Mac, who ate all the chocolate, they're stuck at sea, and their family members had to be notified. So